Hello and welcome to Collect the Thoughts, the show where I collect my thoughts on video games, and today we're gonna be reviewing The Sinking City. This was a game I picked up a few months ago and I kinda just played it and then didn't really feel like playing it anymore. So what ended up happening was I just had this game on my hard drive weighing me down because it is like 35 gigabytes. And so I had to make a decision, actually finish it or uninstalling it, which for me is a bit of a death sentence for games. When I get to that point, usually it means I'm not gonna be returning to it, at least not for quite a lot of years. So I sat down and I played it to make that decision, and I found myself kinda getting into it, which to be fair is something that happens a lot. It was something that also happened with, for example, Deus Ex Human Revolution, which is an amazing game, but it wasn't really clicking with me before that because I hadn't really ever played a game like that before I played Human Revolution. And to an extent there is a level of that here. Sinking City is a exploration, investigation game, but also a survival horror. And while this is not particularly two genres that are rare to see together, it is rare to see the focus being on the investigation side. Combat here definitely feels like a secondary thought, and it is one of the biggest critiques you can make of it, but we'll get into it. Let's first start by talking about the story, which takes place in this Lovecraftian setting. The Sinking City, aside from being the name of the game, is also the setting. You go to this sinking city for some mysterious, very Lovecraftian reasons that you're gonna figure out throughout the game. As you play as this private detective who's been having these weird visions that do bring him to this city. So the game progresses through kind of your work as a private detective and how the cases you work on kind of relate with your own problems, since everything kind of ends up relating to these visions and to this sinking city. It's actually surprisingly hard to talk about this game's story without talking about the gameplay because of the way the story affects the gameplay and the other way around, being a bit disappointing to say the least. What do I mean by this? Well, the story affects the gameplay in quite a few ways. For example, the visions relate to also our main character's sanity, which in the gameplay is represented by a sanity bar, kinda like, let's say, amnesia, kind of? Where the lower the bar is, the weirder things you start to see on the game, and your vision also gets a bit shaky. But it's also very wishy-washy with it, since unlike the health bar, this one kinda just goes up on its own sometimes, and for most of the game it's pretty hard to make it go down enough that you'd have to worry about it. And even beyond that, even though you do wanna keep it up, because if it goes down all the way you die, but also, it's not like the effects of these visions are particularly that hard to deal with. They're mostly just overlaid on the screen, supposed to be like, scary visions, like you'll see our main character hanged or you'll see a monster walk in your direction. But it's very clearly an overlay, of course, because when you move the camera, they move as well. It can startle you at first when it first happens, but you very quickly get used to it, and it really fails at creating a fear of not really knowing what is real or isn't. Now, the other aspect of the game that correlates to the story is of course just the investigation aspect of it. And each individual case you get into is actually surprisingly engaging, as you are given fairly tough choices usually. Everyone is a bit morally grey, and so when you take on a case you'll find yourself working for people who aren't particularly good, and the people that are investigating aren't either. And the game will give you choices. Sometimes someone you're investigating will turn around and give you a choice to kind of double cross the person that hired you. And while this could lead to some cool effects, I think the way the game ultimately presents these and deals with them ends up making them somewhat underwhelming. Let me explain why that is. As you take on a case, you're gonna get clues, of course, and then you'll be able to match these clues with other clues to make assumptions to a point where by the end of the case you'll have a few options of what you can assume. Your assumptions will be mostly based on character traits, like for example, thinking that a character is doing something purely for selfish needs rather than the ones he actually tells you about, which in this way the game actually does a really good job because it never quite tells you the truth and leaves a lot of it to you to do those kind of assumptions. But the choices are very clear on the table and you just kind of know what choices the game will take regardless. There isn't really that immersive sim moment where you could be like, I don't like either of these choices, I'm gonna kind of do my own thing, and the game will adapt to it. And that's unfortunate because it actually feels like they could have done it, since a lot of the times, most of the cases really just give you information that progresses the story and doesn't actually affect the world all that much. Which is a bit of a shame, especially in a game where you're supposed to be in a city that's slowly sinking. Visually, very little ever changes until the very end of the game. And I think this is probably the biggest downside of the story. While some of the individual cases might actually be really good, they never really amount to a very cohesive whole. And then the end of the game just kinda happens. Without spoiling, it really just kinda happens. You are given choices that have nothing to do with all the options you have done thus far. You'll have the same options no matter what route you took, what choices you made throughout your game, and all the endings are pretty much the same. And that could be fine, it could be at the point, and it might be. But it also comes out a bit as lazy due to kinda how short and similar to each other they are. Of course, this is very hard to talk about spoiling, but the best way I can put it, and this might be considered a mild spoiler, so cover your ears for 5 seconds, is there isn't really a good ending, they're all bad. Which once again could be the point, but you know, still not particularly satisfying. Now let's focus a bit more on the gameplay bit, and this is where the game is definitely even more at its weakest, which was a sentence that didn't make any sense, but go along with it. Well, since we're talking about the story just now, let's start by talking a bit more about how the investigation works. And mostly it's gonna be around going from place to place and talking to people in certain areas, and also doing a bit of investigation inside buildings in this very Batman Arkham games type of way, where you have this special vision that allows you to see, you know, things that aren't there. This being justified by, of course, being your visions having this sort of supernatural connection. And it's fine, it's enjoyable enough, especially as these help you uncover more about the people you're working for, creating those dynamics that I think are interesting in this game of kind of not knowing who's in the right. But also it gets pretty repetitive pretty fast, as it really boils down to go to a place, investigate it, then go to another place, talk to someone, go to another place, investigate, and so on and so forth, with some combat sprinkled in at some point during that chain. And it can be pretty annoying just kind of going from one end of the map to another. While the Sinking City has some pretty interesting locations in the way that some parts of the city are, you know, sunken and you have to move by boat, but the actual traversal is so slow that you're just gonna want to fast travel everywhere. And this is where a big advice I would give you is, anytime you get to a new area, look for the fast travel point, because it makes it a lot less annoying to get back to that area, which will inevitably happen. This will also minimize combat, since a lot of the times, shorter path possible, it will probably come across an infected area, which leads me to talk about the actual survival horror aspect of this game and its combat. In a lot of ways it is a very simple, over-the-shoulder kind of gun-focused gameplay, even though you'll not have a lot of ammo throughout the game. Most of the challenge here I found comes from managing your health. It doesn't regenerate on its own and it goes by quite fast even when upgraded. It's not the worst combat I've ever played, but it's also very bland. Guns don't feel particularly satisfying. killing enemies doesn't feel particularly satisfying, and it really just feels like something you have to deal with when it happens during your investigations rather than something you sought out to do. Even though the game kind of wants you to do, as the open world is filled with, these areas that are infested by monsters, but the game wants you to go there and explore to get resources. But the thing is, you don't need these resources for your investigations. You just need these resources to do combat. So there's very little incentive to do it unless you're, one, needing those items for some kind of upcoming battle, maybe boss battle, or if you just want to do combat, which you probably won't want to do that. And I would say for most of the game you're fine just going through the cases and not having to worry about any of this, since the places you investigate during the main story or even during the side cases will have plenty enough, I think, for the combat that you get in those cases. And so it kinda stands to question why even have this survival horror aspect, or at least have it in this way. And it's probably an unfinished thing. Maybe they wanted to be a lot more than it actually was. This was probably their first attempt at combat, Frogware being mostly known for their investigative games like Sherlock Holmes rather than these more action focused ones, even though this is not really an action focused game, really. Personally though, I would have rather them just stuck to investigation and maybe flesh out the sanity bar and vision things a bit more in an interesting way, rather than what we have here, which is a bit of a gimmick. But this also leads me to talk about a recommendation for you if you decide to play this game, which is the difficulty settings. And there are two that you can change alternatively, and it is the combat and the actual puzzles investigation kind of thing. And my advice here would be keep the combat on easy so you don't really come across a situation where maybe you're stuck because of the combat, which would be annoying because once again the combat is really not the strong suit here. And then put the investigation setting on the normal or above. And the reason why I say that is because on easy it can feel a bit like the game is on auto mode, where it just kind of tells you what everything does. The main thing here would be just kind of telling you what each hint can be used for. Like for example, a certain hint is meant for you to go talk to someone, or another one might want you to go to the library or the police to search through archives. Here, this archive sort of gameplay, it's basically just a matching game. You look at the clue and you see certain hints, and then you match them on the archive description, something like in which area did it take place, what year did it take place in, and then you try to find a matching, file. It's very automatic, so you can kind of cheat it a bit. Like for example, if you're only managing to understand 2 of the clues that are in the text, then you can just kind of guess the third one by trial and error. It's not really that hard. This one just kind of turned out to be an asset that could be really fun, but the implementation is really just kind of boring, unfortunately. It really just makes you have to go to these places to research, which once again is just kind of walking around from one place to another. And well, to finish this off, let's also talk about the graphics and sound, I guess. They're fine. It's obviously not a AAA game, and it's obviously not quite an indie game either. It's a bit of a more substantial team here, Frogware, and it looks like their other games. It's like this AA quality, where you can tell there's a little bit of money behind it, but definitely not a lot. And it looks fine. Personally, I think the Steam screenshots are a bit misleading. The game looks a lot better on those screenshots. But the game itself does have that mood and does have a really interesting aesthetic. We don't get a lot of Lovecraftian games, especially not 3D ones. So it's actually very understandable why this was such a popular game when it came out. And if that's really all you want, just some Lovecraftian imagery, then this game does that pretty alright. But I do have to talk about the character models for a bit, because while there are some cool and very detailed character models, especially for characters that aren't quite human, Lovecraftian stuff, there's also a lot of repeats, even for just regular humans, where it's a lot easier to tell. There was this cop, and there was this medic, and there was like another random guy in the fish market, and these were all the same character model. And they weren't the same character, they were different characters with lines of dialogue in the game. It wasn't just a random NPC walking in the street. That's what's kind of weird about it. It's very distracting, and it honestly made me think, oh, it's you, and then they'll be like, no, I'm completely new character. And it's very distracting and kind of messes with the gameplay, because you think it's another character and it makes it confusing. Regardless though, it's fine. Moving on to the soundtrack, it sounds okay. It's a lot of ambient scary noises. I'm not the best at describing music, but I would say it's like low and gravelly kind of constant notes, a lot of that. It feels like noise, but it's like a persistent noise rather than something like, Silent Hill, where it feels like someone is smashing the kitchen. But I like when people smash the kitchen, but this one is not bad either. It's more like a lingering sound, if that makes any sense. But it also has a tendency, because of the way it is, that it just kind of goes into the back of your head and you don't really think about it because it is so constant. Anyways, overall, this is kind of what this game is. It has a lot of potential and cool ideas, but most of them don't really pan out, making them kind of just exist in this game as somewhat bland and gimmicky. And when you describe this game in its bare state, it's really not interesting. It really is kind of the cases and the writing here that kind of pushes it forward to not be completely unbearable. And for those reasons, I am giving The Sinking City a 5 out of 10. Now, in terms of recommendations, it is very hard to recommend, but I actually have what I think is a very apt description of the type of people that will enjoy this. And the type of people that will enjoy this are the people that liked Murdered Soul Suspect. Maybe my younger viewers are not going to remember this game, and maybe a lot of my older viewers probably never even heard of it, but this was a game that came out at the beginning of the PS4, Xbox One generation, but it was really a PS3 and Xbox 360 game, if you know what I mean, and it didn't get a lot of attention, and the attention it did get was pretty negative, but I weirdly enjoyed it in the same way that I did this game, because it was an investigative game where the investigation gameplay wasn't particularly good, and the more actiony gameplay, it wasn't really combat in that game, was terrible, but there was something that was very engaging about the story. And that's kind of how this game feels to me as well. That being said, I had this weird feeling that if I played Murder Suspect again now as an adult, I would probably hate it, but who knows. What matters here is that today, as a grown man, I enjoyed The Sinking City in that same way that I enjoyed that game back then. So the way I kind of am processing this into a recommendation is, if you like the supernatural aspect mixed with the investigation aspect and can deal with a lot of janky and gimmicky gameplay, then I do think you might enjoy this game. But it's a might, and it's also quite a big ask to be able to just kind of put up with gimmicky gameplay. Especially when the reward for putting up with it is just some mildly interesting gameplay and not like, oh, you really have to put up with the gameplay because the story is amazing. No, it's mildly interesting, and that's kind of what you have to be aware of. I'm sure a lot of people just play this because they want more Lovecraftian games, and if that's you, then maybe you can find something in that. Personally, I'm not very familiar with Lovecraft, and to me this isn't much more than a cool setting. Regardless of what your decision is though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing and liking and even commenting, all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.